Well, good evening and welcome again to Economics Unbound. Tonight we look back at some of the highlights of the year 2019. Now, many of our regular viewers will remember that we kicked off on the 14th of February 2019. And what a year it's been. We've looked at the debt in the SOEs, we looked at the sovereign debt, we've looked at the recessionary environment in South Africa, and we have looked at the main economic issues and debates of our time. But let's get straight into it.
In 2006, the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa published a study into housing entrepreneurs in South Africa. The central question of the research was, if the housing asset is not performing as a financial asset for low-income earners, might there be a different way homeowners can make money from their housing? Their findings were very significant and serve as pointers towards a policy of the future. CAHF says that their research focused on small-scale landlords and home-based enterprises in the inner cities and townships of Gauteng. They say they found that housing provides a critical platform for residents to become entrepreneurs, either as small-scale landlords or home-based enterprises, earning an income and building their asset wealth. Banks and policymakers have been slow to realize the potential of this market if institutionally supported and aided. We spoke to Gqubule-Mbeki, co-founder of Indlu, and Mba of KW Advance on the matter.
There's a lot of influx of tenants into this market. We're specifically interested in the backyard rental market. There's been a lot of development in this area in the last few years, and landowners are making stable income out of their properties, and it's largely fueled by urbanization and people moving into the metropolitan areas in the townships.
Massive inflows from rural areas and from north of the continent.
Absolutely.
TT, what does the market look like from your end of town? I understand that you run a very high market operation, and there are very many high market properties coming into the market in the townships, especially areas like Diepkloof in Soweto. Can you talk?
100%.
Yeah.
There is a definite increase in the value of different properties in the townships. And as you rightly mentioned, areas like Diepkloof, Pimville, Protea, they're growing in terms of the value of the properties that are being sold. But
Can you give me an estimation, perhaps, like how much would the really nice house go for in Diepkloof? 3-bedroomed, 2 bathrooms, guest bathroom downstairs, nice open plan lounge and dining space?
You'd be surprised that you can get a property, as per the description that you've just stated, for anything between 8 to 1.1 million. The market is quite active in those areas, purely because it offers...
You mean
800,000 to 1.1 million, yes.
I would say that's a depressed price, wouldn't you?
Not if you look at the history of the property market in the township specifically. And as you've realized, there's been an influx of growth in terms of shopping malls and hospitals and schools. And I think because of the activity that's grown in the townships, it's obviously helped with increasing the property values in those specific townships. But I still think and believe that there's a lot more work that still needs to be done, specifically in that space, where we need to grow more schools, build more hospitals, and more amenities so that people in the townships can actually get services within the townships. They don't have to go to the suburban areas to get those services at the end of the day.
Now, is there a Kasi price for a beautiful house, and is there a northern suburbs price? And what would you say is the price difference on average?
Well, I think on average it goes back to the point that everyone will tell you about location. Location. You take a typical house in Diepkloof, which you can get for, let's say, R1 million. Take the exact same house and put it in Sandton, and you can triple the price, purely because of the location and purely because of the value per square meter of each area that we're dealing with. So there is a significant difference.
Talk to me about the rental market. What are the dynamics that we need to take heed of in this particular market?
Well, there's about 850,000 backyard landlords at the moment renting their properties. I think their biggest constraint at this point is access to capital. Even though they have significant income, passive income from the rental that they collect, that income is not recognized by the commercial banks. which only looks at salaried income. So I believe that if there can be more specific financial products targeted for these landlords, they would be able to upgrade their backyard facilities, which would increase their income and would make a dent in the massive housing backlog that we have in the country.
Okay, let's talk valuations. Because I think that getting a formal valuation from a bank or done by valuation experts is one way of beginning the formalization of township houses and unearthing what we are calling on the show and what economists have referred to as dead capital. So how difficult is it to get a nice, decent valuation on a township property?
Well, the way we look at it is you can almost calculate it on a cap rate basis, on a yield basis, like you would on a commercial project, because all of these properties are income generating because of the rental that is there. So the way we look at it, and I'm specifically looking at it out of the rental point of view, you can almost say, what is my expected yield? And based on that, we've seen high valuations in the townships. I mean, even if you can go on to Property 24 right now, and you will find properties in Soweto or Tembisa that would be selling for over 2 million rand.
Wow.
And that would be based on the income. If you look at the photos, you'll see that there's about 10 to 20 rental properties on that side generating income. But people are starting to look at these residential sites as businesses or assets, which is skewing, I think, the normal property valuations for maybe a single family dwelling.
Now I want to talk about Vilakazi Street. Vilakazi Street is perhaps the best known street in South Africa. And it has 3 Nobel Prize winners who lived on that street, and it's a booming tourist attraction. Are properties rising in that area? Are we seeing significant gentrification? Now, gentrification could be a good thing and a bad thing for ordinary people. Talk to me about how you see the trajectory of that street. How is it going to go?
Do you want me to take that?
Yes.
With pleasure. Of course, Vilakazi being such a well-known street across the world would obviously over time increase with value. But what we've seen from a sales point of view is the reluctance of a lot of homeowners to actually let go of those properties. There's a lot of sentiment that comes with these properties. Your grandmother's house that you've inherited, and so it goes. But specifically when it comes to these backroom issues and the evaluation part when it comes to sales, the biggest challenge for the evaluators is the fact that most of these backroom establishments are actually not approved by the council, which becomes a big issue for an evaluator to say.
Municipal,
of course, if it's not approved, it's pretty difficult for an evaluator to actually put what the real value of that property is. You have a structure at the back that is probably 100 squares under roof, but it's not recognized because it's not approved in terms of the plans of the council, which makes it difficult when you have to sell on that particular property. That's the biggest challenge. Maybe for rentals it's a little bit different, but when it comes to sales, it does pose a challenge when you're trying to get out as much value from that property as you can, because if it's not approved, it really doesn't exist.
If it's not approved, it doesn't exist, and hence it's dead capital.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about title deeds. In townships, we've had for generations the 99-year lease on the typical matchbox home. And in all our families, we've got that typical home. And there's, as you say, a lot of sentiment to how that home is either mortgaged or treated by generations. So how can it be that 25 years into democracy and we're still discussing how to deal with the apartheid 99-year lease on township homes?
Well, in townships, we typically see people having title deeds. The problem being more that they don't always administer the title deeds. So they inherit property, but the admin lags, which is causing dead capital, because it's now the title deed is not in
bureaucracy,
in the name of the occupant, who's by the standard of the community, the legal occupant or owner of that property, but the title deed doesn't necessarily reflect that. And so we're seeing that as a constraint. That and people actually trading properties without doing the administration of the title deeds.
Let's talk about zoning for business and for residential use. It's a bit mixed in the township at the moment. When we spent a day out there looking at the properties in particular, we saw that people would pull a room and then make a spaza shop, or pull a room and make a hairdresser. And people would also have a number of back rooms that they're renting out to people. So there's a blurring of the lines between what is really residential and what is business zoning. So how do you see the future of that panning out?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, there's official zoning. The different townships have got different zonings, and it's mostly residential one, which really means you cannot legally do business there. But people obviously still do. They rented out the pieces of the yard, rented out to retailers that put up little formal stores. What we have seen is some of the municipalities catching on. For instance, as far as my knowledge goes, almost the entire Mamelodi has been rezoned to Res 5, which now gives a much broader spec of rights, which now obviously validates a lot of these activities and actually increase the value of those properties.
I'm getting nostalgic just watching that again. Now, here's something else I would likely get nostalgic about, and that is in their first round of quantitative easing, in the initial response to the crisis, the American Central Bank called the US Federal Reserve, did so by buying back securities in the secondary market. And by the time that the United States in late 2014 wound down the buying program, the balance sheet of their central bank had expanded considerably. Now, their books had grown from $800 billion at the beginning of the program to 4.5 trillion. Now, we spoke to Anne Pettifor, the author of The Production of Money and Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, who joined us from London by Skype. Here's that interview.
The South African Reserve Bank has, for many, many years, undertaken something called open market operations. I checked on their website this afternoon. They explained quite clearly that they do it on an everyday basis. But they do it primarily for the banking system, and they do it primarily to help the bank, which is the role of the central bank, is to support the commercial banking system and make sure that it works well. In a crisis as there was in 2007-9, the central bank goes a little bit further, and instead of just buying and exchanging and creating credit, if you like, for the commercial banking system, it also, the Central Bank of Britain and the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, all purchased what are called government assets, which is government debt, which is government bonds. The government promises to pay, has a bond, makes a bond, issues a bond, or a gilt here in the UK. And what the central banks did was to buy those bonds from the market. And by taking those bonds off the market and putting them onto their balance sheet, they raised the price of the bonds because now there were fewer bonds, government bonds in the market, and then that lowered the yield. And that helped the government. It helped the government in borrowing because then the interest rate on their bonds, on their promise to pay, was much lower. And that was terribly important and a really useful thing to do. But what the QE did was it was primarily helping the finance sector. So if you had an account with the Fed, and you could only have an account with the Fed or the Bank of England or the South African Reserve Bank if you are A, the government, B, a bank, see a pension fund or else another big financial institution. Those are the only institutions that can have an account with the Fed. If you had an account with the Fed, you could get cheap money from the Fed in exchange for putting collateral or an asset on the balance sheet of the Fed or the Bank of England. And what that did was it meant that the private sector got rid of a lot of bad loans, a lot of toxic assets, and it got credit, cheap credit from the central bank. Now, that was good for them, but it didn't really help the rest of the economy, despite what Mr. Bernanke says, because the whole idea was to ensure that banks had more liquidity, if you like, that they had got some of the problem loans off their balance sheet, and then they were supposed to go into the real economy and lend money to SMEs and to other corporations
and
at a low rate.
And instead of going into the real economy, they bought equities.
Exactly. They went into speculation on the stock markets, in buying securities in the shadow banking sector. They had a wonderful time with all this new credit, and with that they used speculation to earn more money. Now, the real problem is how to get money into the real economy, and South Africa has a big problem. South Africa has an unemployment rate of 41% amongst black people. That is massive economic failure on behalf, I may say so, of both the central bank, the Reserve Bank of South Africa, but also of the government. The fact is that the government and the central bank should be working together with both monetary policy and fiscal policy to create the conditions which enable both the private sector to create jobs, but also the public sector to create jobs. And it's not the role of a corporation to create the conditions in which the economy should thrive.
What would you say, Anne, to the argument that our bank, our central bank, the South African Reserve Bank, cannot do that within its current narrowly defined mandate of price stability, that we would need to give it an expanded mandate and permission to use more monetary policy tools for it to do what you are suggesting perhaps that it does? It looks into doing.
I think it's very important that the mandate should be broadened to include full employment. The Federal Reserve has a mandate to ensure that in the United States there is full employment. That's, and that's a condition that they have, that their monetary policy has to do that. The problem is, Thandika, is that we now have a situation of what is called monetary dominance and fiscal conservatism, where the central bank has to do all the heavy lifting. And that's not possible. In any stable economy, the central bank and the government work together. Monetary policy and fiscal policy should work together. But quite right now, the economic ideology is that there should only be, the central bank should be the only active partner in this process, and that the government should cut back on spending, it should not invest, it should not be financing big infrastructure projects in the economy, it shouldn't be creating jobs, instead it should be contracting its spending. There should be what's known as basically deflationary fiscal policy. And that's the mistake. I'm strongly in favor of the expanding of the mandate of the central bank, but what we also have to now is rebalance the debate, so we use both monetary and fiscal policy to address what is a big economic failure in South Africa, and that is its very high level of unemployment.
Now, in late last year, we at the SABC were invited to Indonesia to see their institutional arrangements for fiscal and monetary policy management. Now, we saw there that there was a committee, an institutional mechanism for harmonizing both fiscal and monetary policy. Now, we don't have such an institutional mechanism in South Africa. What would you recommend we do?
Well, I'm not sure that you need an institution. I mean, I think it's very good to have a committee that makes sure that that happens. Really, it is the responsibility of the government. The central bank, it has to be relatively independent, but it is a government department, in fact. Those are civil servants. The central bank governor is a political appointment in the United States, in Britain, and in South Africa.
Now, no single definition or approach encompasses the concept of economic democracy, but most proponents claim that modern property relations externalize costs, lower the general well-being of all, and deny the polity a democratic voice in economic policy decisions. Now, we discussed this a while ago with the author of Casinomics, Gqubule-Mbeki, and Pelisa Nkomo of the ANC.
I think a lot of it is about actually bringing informal sectors into a formal economy and making it more inclusive, because we talk about unemployment at a high level, but we ignore the scale and the potential of that informal economy, which is huge. I mean, if you just look at everything from like the Muti traders, Muti, is worth 3 billion rand, employs 200,000 people, let alone, the hawkers business or hair care or any of these others. So we have this huge economy in the informal sector, in the streets, in the Gasi, wherever it might be, which we need to bring in. They're unable to access things like finance, they're unable to get security of tenure, they have no security of the space that they're trading in, and they're they can't get many of the benefits that a formal business would, which is wrong.
Now, Pelisa, what do you think of what Gigi has just shared with us?
I mean, well, certainly I think with the research that I've done through my thesis, absolutely that's a problem statement. But I think one of the key things that the government has done in the last 5 years is the commitment to the township economy. And part of it is to make it sure that how do we formalize township economy, but as well because part of formalization, you're able to provide proper resources. But at the same time, the issues around access to markets, because the markets exist actually in the township. The difference is that people take a taxi and go and shop somewhere else and then come back. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit within the township economy. For example, the food economy is a huge economy, in fact, food production. And we know the issues around the concentration of food production, if you start from the primary sector to agro-processing. So in essence, and I think what Gauteng government in particular has really been the lead in ensuring that it actually provides opportunities. I mean, 2 critical policy regimes they've actually introduced in Gauteng.
Now, Pelisa, we've followed this thrust into the township economies by the Gauteng government, taking the lead on behalf of the rest of government. There is a lot of rhetoric and not enough implementation. That's what we are finding as journalists. Are we wrong in seeing it that way?
Well, I mean, you may not be entirely wrong. I mean, the strategy is really 3 years. 2 things, though, I mean, that problem is that the first issue is that initially you'd know that there was no special dispensation for township enterprises. I mean, now Gauteng government has actually passed a law that allows that township, any business opportunity that is below 1 million must be given to a township entrepreneurship. I think for me, already the government is kind of like taking a stand and showing a commitment that in fact is actually the responsibility of the state to contribute in private sector development. I think the second issue where there's a very clarity, it's around how do you township enterprises benefit from the multiplier effects of the public sector spending. So there's a whole process which the provincial treasury has actually set up.
Yes, and we will get to that. How do township businesses benefit from public spending? But I was fascinated with your book, and in your book you say that other South Africans who are not exposed to townships think that these are places of desolation, of abject poverty and of depression. But you have found another side to the township, one that is vibrant, one that is emergent, one that is survivalist and very, very confident. But amid all of this vibrancy and chaos in the midst of markets in these townships, what is the actual structure that you found of the township economy?
So maybe let me start with, my follow-up book to Gasinomics was called Gasinomic Revolution, because I think there is this huge revolution happening in the informal sector, and it's happening despite government, it's happening despite corporate South Africa, it's happening despite this, and it's not a survivalist economy. These are businesses that are actually very successful. I mean, I wrote about the one lady in downtown Joburg. Her and her husband sell 3,000 Fekuk Amagwenya every single morning, plus about 500 rands worth worth of other stuff. So they turn over 3,500 rand every single day, 6 days a week, and they make about 50% profit on that.
No, that's what Pelisa was talking about the food economy.
And exactly. I mean, the food economy in South Africa, what I call Gasikos, is worth about 87 billion rand, with about 200,000 people engaged in this economy. So the thing is about that is that this same lady I was talking about in downtown Joburg, the thing about her and her husband is they've been there for 15 years. They have no security. If you ask them what restricts them from investing in their business, they'll say there's no guarantee. And this is the thing we have to change. There's two things that is. The first is, is there a guarantee that that business can continue? This is people living on it. They're employing people. The one lady in Tembisa who's a school mama that I interviewed, she's been there for 26 years. She's put 2 children through university through her little school tuck shop.
Okay, let's hold those two ideas. Do you need to respond to that? Okay.
No, I mean, he's absolutely correct. But here's the issue, though, is that one of the things that we've discovered, we had a program in Gauteng and we went to all the townships, and we discovered that some of the micro businesses in particular are scared of registering themselves because they're scared of tax, right? Because then they're saying, it's like a chicken and egg. So if I register, will I get access to finance, or should I declare what I'm making? And the state says, register yourself. We will know that you are actually exempted to pay tax, but so that we understand the bouquet of support that you actually need to be, you require.
If you two can allow me, I have a little game as usual for us to play. Now you have to take one of these things. There are solutions to things like access to capital, things like tax, and things like the importance of solidarity to small businesses and the importance of trust in the township economy. Can you just take a piece of paper and tell me what you think of the solution, and first read out what the solution is?
Oh my goodness.
What are you laughing at?
No, this one, the Chinese way. A special account at the central bank, a special interest rate for small businesses.
Yes, a special interest rate for small businesses. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the...
Melissa, we've got high interest rates in this country.
No, there are a number of things that you have to do. I think the starting point is that, which I think South African government has actually implemented, is the tax incentives for SMMEs. And sometimes SMME actually don't understand that that's exemption they have.
Those businesses typically fail in the first 5 years, those that don't make it. Do you think that a tax break of 5 years would be good?
No, absolutely. In fact, that's the first issue, the tax break issue, which actually it's a regime that also exists. I think there's something else here that we also need to look at it, is that, remember, with the micro and small businesses, they don't have opportunities in the value chain.
We cannot talk about climate change and not mention carbon. This is because scientists have found a direct relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and climate change. Researchers used a combination of global climate models and historical climate data to show that there is a simple linear relationship between total cumulative emissions and global temperature change. What does all of this mean for economics? To answer this question, we were joined by Brett Kloot, who's a climate change and energy economist at DNA Economics, and Happy Gqubule, who's a political advisor at Greenpeace Africa.
What we need to do about the problem actually is just to arrest all the emissions that are coming out. Many countries every year tend to go to what is called the COP negotiations, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where they start to discuss and negotiate about the nitty-gritties of what should be done at an international level. And whatever outcomes that come from there tend to not trickle down to what is happening at a national level. And so the ambition to actually deal with the issues of climate change at a national level aren't high enough. Even if you look at the political party manifestos, you tend to see that the problem is not necessarily understood and is not even accepted as happening right now. So we still have an idea that it's going to happen in the future. So we need to stop emitting, and we need to start dealing with the impacts of climate change as they're happening in KwaZulu-Natal as well as in Mozambique and broadly around the world.
So it's not understood either as an economic issue or as a social issue, or the importance of prioritizing it on party political policy promises. We have a bill that Minister Tito Mboweni put before Parliament late last year. I think it was November last year. And it says that we will have a carbon tax regime, and if you fall foul of it, you will suffer certain penalties. Do you think this is enough?
Okay. Well, the carbon tax alone is not enough. In fact, even if the carbon tax is applied the way it is presumed to be operationalized, it won't necessarily reach us or let us reach the necessary emission reductions that we need. So the carbon tax is only part of a mix of measures. So there are other things such as the climate change bill. There's an actual bill that is being developed. There's also the Environmental Management Act, certain sections which will enable us to arrest some of these emissions, because those carbon emissions don't happen in isolation. They happen through industry being able to produce what it produces. And alongside those emissions, there's also air pollution and particulate matter issues.
What does this mean for economics?
Today, I think Happy made a very good point. I think the carbon tax on its own is not enough. It won't change behavior. Behavior will only change once firms start to understand the value of carbon. What the carbon tax does do is it puts a price on carbon, which means just like any other factor of production, like labor or capital or land, you now have to start using your carbon more efficiently. And I think that's the first step in trying to get people to think long term, to kind of think, put this into the decision making. Because the physical impacts of carbon tax, of climate change you spoke about earlier, that's not the only risk we face when looking at climate change. There's also a risk in the fact that the world is moving to a low carbon economy. We're trying to avoid catastrophic climate change. In doing that, governments throughout the world are putting in place measures to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's happening throughout the world, not just in South Africa. So there's, at the latest count, there's 48 countries in the world that have a carbon price in place, 28 subnational jurisdictions. So the days of not paying for carbon is effectively over, and the sooner that South Africa understands that and tries to plan accordingly, we're very well positioned. We have great renewable energy resources. If anything, the low carbon transition can be an amazing economic driver for South Africa, and it can really sow the seeds for a really job-rich, just transition to a low carbon economy.
Now, they say that the rich pollute and the poor suffer. Is this too simplistic a view? Can you unpack it for me?
Well, there's definitely truth in that the carbon emissions associated with particularly the developed countries are per capita are much higher than the developed countries. The whole emphasis on trying to reduce climate change did originate in the developed countries, so they are starting to take responsibility for that. Unfortunately, the magnitude of the problem is such that everyone has to chip in now. It's not just it's not a developing country issue anymore. Everyone has to has to pull together. But at the same time, the developed countries have benefited for basically a century now from the carbon emissions they used to develop, and they've built up resources and capital as a result of that. So one of the cornerstones of the international negotiations is that part of that money should be used to fund mitigation activities in developing countries, in order to avoid catastrophic climate change.
And at the London School of Economics, there is a program there to teach economists on how to design carbon markets where people trade their emission coupons. Can you explain how this works and why it's important to think about such measures, if it is?
Well, yes. Carbon trading is one of the mechanisms, like I say, to put a price on carbon. The carbon tax is another mechanism. They both have strengths and weaknesses. But essentially, what you want to do is you want to take that externality cost currently. So, as you were saying, the cost that's borne by society, the cost of the floods, the cost of disease patterns that are changing, of drought, and all of this, and you want that cost to be associated with the carbon emissions. So the people that are emitting the carbon that is causing this damage in the long term, they're the ones that should be funding, that should be paying for that right. So the mechanism is less important than actually putting a price on carbon and internalizing this externality cost.
Now, Happy, what's the importance of activism and public involvement and awareness throughout the world, and what's the role of solidarity between all those forces opposing degradation of our climate?
Well, the linchpin of all of that movement is that we were trying to make sure that the political debate doesn't stop with just what happens at the international negotiations. That the politicians and the political principles or the organizations that are making the decisions have an idea that public opinion is around that climate change needs to be addressed, that it is a threat, that it is a state of emergency. You can't have a situation where you have two preceding cyclones impacting a same region all the time and the severity is just becoming worse. And at the same time, in the same continent, you're having drought-like conditions and floods in random areas. It is a crisis. It is an emergency. So
we need to do more than just charity about this matter, bringing food parcels to Mozambique and so on. That's insufficient. There needs to be a far more developed public response. Shouldn't we take this issue onto the streets as citizens if politicians are going to react, as that clip said?
I mean, people are doing that in various ways, and I think the idea that South Africans or Africans are able to do that at the same level as maybe people in Europe is kind of weird, due to the fact that we've got other issues that we're dealing with. Maybe it's the manner in which we articulate those issues. It would actually show that there's a linkage between climate change happening and the fact that if you do not have water or do not have access to food, is as a result of you not being able to grow as a result of climate change. So our articulation of the issues might just need to be much more refined, but at the core of this is that people are already taking action.
In his State of the Nation address earlier this year, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the power utility would be unbundled into 3 entities, responsible for generation, transmission and distribution. This move that has angered trade unions and apparently divided opinion within the ruling ANC is intended to break Eskom's monopoly and foster a sense of healthy competition and accountability. We spoke to SAFTU General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi and energy expert Chris Yolande.
He's talking billions of overrun. Yes. And time overruns, not one executive in prison, not one person ever in court to say what happened, to answer that question. So we are now being asked to enter into another journey, get into the journey of the independent power producers, 27 agreements signed behind our backs. Nobody knew anything about them. They are all in multinational corporations. We have been given certain guarantees. And this is the point that I think we must highlight in this discussion. How many South Africans are aware that these independent power producers are being subsidized by Eskom?
Can you just tell our viewers who these people are?
There are 27 of them, yeah. And we see that their partners are related to the first family. Yet again, the same syndrome that makes us to be very worried about the past that is not properly addressed, and we are now asked to just say, accept international investors, there will be 56 billion rands that is coming into the economy and 20,000 jobs. Lies. We are seeing decommissioning of the old power plants that are going to lead to massive job losses in Mpumalanga, where people are not being even consulted. That's the first point. We don't know. The country doesn't know that as we speak, we are subsidizing these 27 power producers, all of them coming from overseas. The country doesn't know that all of their equipment for the renewables are ready-made, produced elsewhere in the world, coming into South Africa to help create jobs where they are being produced in a country where 58% of its youth is unemployed.
Mr. Yenan, come in. Are you
I think it's
disputing
important.
These facts?
I'd like to focus on areas where we agree with each other.
Yes.
And one area that we agree with each other is there has been a lack of accountability for the mistakes of Matupi and Kusile and corruption and mismanagement. I think we agree on that. The question is, what is the solution? And that's what hasn't been proposed yet. But I want to give you a solution.
Yes.
The best way of ensuring accountability is to increase the number of shareholders. At the moment, there is one shareholder represented by one shareholder representative, the Minister of Public Enterprises, and he is playing with taxpayers' money, not his own money. That is a recipe for lack of accountability.
But Mr. Vavi could easily say that it isn't the diversity of shareholders that makes the difference,
It is.
but it's the diversity of
just a nice
stakeholders
theory.
that may make the
Let me
difference.
tell you, when you have got skin in the game, money invested, outside shareholders with money invested, then you get accountability
Mr. Yennan, what
in a
would-
much better
a
way.
community has got more than skin in the game. If you had a multi-stakeholder board for ESCOM, if you had a different governance structure, we wouldn't be talking about a lack of consultation because those communities would be represented in the board rather directly. We wouldn't
Why
be
isn't
talking
the
about...
PIC, who represent the pensioners and the workers of ESCOM, why is it not represented on the board?
And
I
why
believe it
are
should
the
be.
workers
Not only on the
themselves
board,
not on the
but they
board?
should be shareholders. The PIC should not just be a lender of money. It should be a shareholder that can participate and watch its money carefully. At the moment, it's a lender and it's not able to watch its money properly.
There seems,
There's
Mr.
very
Vavi,
two
to be
more
something
important
wrong governance-wise,
Yes.
something systemic, and that you need to find a governance model that accommodates all the stakeholders in the energy thing in order to achieve what the other contributor said was energy democracy, bringing it into the utility of the
agree.
future.
I agree.
And that would then ruggedize and erase the issues of insufficient communication, insufficient consultation, because those particular stakeholders would be directly represented. And money is not the only skin in the game. It's livelihoods, it's jobs, it's futures, it's the environment. Mr. Vavi, what do you say?
This government, led by the ANC, adopted the Freedom Charter in 1955 that wrote a preamble that says the people shall govern. The people shall govern. But unfortunately, it is not the people that are governing. Not even workers employed by ESCOM are being consulted. Worst of all, the communities in Mpumalanga who stand to either benefit or suffer from any process government is happening. The government is actively trying to shave our heads in our absence. The unilateralism, the arrogance that we were speaking about. So let's come back to the point that I think is a point of departure. We in NUMSA, NUM, SAFTU, and a host of other progressive forces in our country believe in a fundamental belief that says energy, like oxygen, water, public education, health care, security, the army, the municipal services
Are a public good.
are the public good that must be produced by a utility of the state in order to perform certain developmental challenges or certain human development challenges. That's our point of departure.
There you
Now,
differ
this
fundamentally
road, that's where
from-
we differ
I
fundamentally.
want to tell you where I agree with you.
Where we differ fundamentally.
want to tell you where I
this
agree.
Where do
roadmap-
you agree with him?
I agree that the answer is not privatization.
Which is what is happening
Okay.
now.
What is the
I
answer?
believe the answer is to increase the public participation in the business of ESCOM and electricity. The public participation, I am a strong believer in energy democracy. And the way to improve energy democracy is to involve the public in the business, not the Minister of Public Enterprises, one person. A real democratization.
Now, I can see you two leaning into each other. I'm almost tempted to lean into you. I want to know what a just transition is. I've asked this question three times on this show, and it seems that there are differing perceptions of what a just transition means. Mr. Vavi, you're likely to say that you believe in a just transition to a desired shared future, and Chris believes in it too, and so does the president, but you're at odds. How do you define it?
Just transition is consultation. Just transition is about involving of the affected parties into development of a plan. Just transition is about sitting down with workers and communities to say we have made a commitment to the international communities that we are bringing down our reliance on coal power and that we are going to be bringing in renewables. And therefore, how are we going to do it in a manner that is going to be sensitive to our developmental challenges, in particular to the crisis of unemployment, to the crisis of underdevelopment in Mpumalanga and elsewhere in the country. Just transition is about then saying to everybody, let's work together. We've already missed it. There's no just transition in South Africa when there's unilateral actions by one department.
He's saying already, Mr. Vavi is saying already that elites have a scheme and that this will be another elite transition. What are you saying?
Again, I want to emphasize the areas where we agree. One thing I can say for sure, there is going to be an energy transition in South Africa, whether we like it or not.
Is it going to be a difficult transition?
The question is whether it is going to be a just transition. There is going to be a transition. But it is not certain that it is going to be a just transition unless we walk this path together. All the stakeholders in the sector, including labor, including communities, including business, which you haven't mentioned, and including government, we have to walk this road together, because if we don't, there will be deep wounds in the side of South Africa's society that will haunt us for decades.
And currently our wound is Eskom.
We need to address what is going to happen with these old stranded communities in the Mpumalanga coal fields, in the Northwest platinum fields, in the Free State gold fields, where there are towns that are dying. We need to look at reindustrializing these to cope with the new green economy, and we need to do this together. And there are such opportunities to walk this path together and to make sure that there's not just a transition that leaves wounds in our side, but a just transition which builds communities and builds on their strengths.
If you're on the same page on that, why did you initially, when we came into studio, defend the consultation process as adequate?
I'm not defending it. I'm stating it as a fact. I'm not defending it.
I told you, as a player inside that alliance, there is no such facts that you are putting on the table.
Well, I can say that the government white paper on energy policy, which is the only energy policy that South Africa has. By the way, this roadmap of Mr. Pravin Gordhan's is not an energy policy or an Eskom policy. It's not even a white paper. It hasn't been adopted by the cabinet yet. It is still being negotiated with Labour.
Oh, what a year it has been. This was, dear viewers, the last live show of Economics Unbound this year. We are back again with you on the 9th of January 2020, where we will attempt to bring you more riveting economic discussions, policy issues, and debates. We are no sinking ship. We are going all the way upwards because we have the honor to be Economics Unbound on the South African public broadcaster. Have a lovely festive season. Goodbye. Thank you.